There's a place in the mountains of Maine where time seems to stand still. Here, America's richest family built something hidden from the world, not to show off, but to disappear. On these granite cliffs above the ocean, one man faced a question even his fortune couldn't answer. What do you leave behind when you already have everything? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. In the summer of 1910, John D. Rockefeller Jr. stood on the edge of a cliff on Mount Desert Island, looking out at Frenchman Bay. He was 36 years old, the son of the world's first billionaire, heir to Standard Oil, the most powerful corporation on Earth. And he was drowning. Not in water, in expectations. His father had built an empire that controlled 90% of America's oil. John Jr. was supposed to protect it, expand it, make it untouchable. But he didn't want it. He never wanted it. While his father crushed competitors and rewrote the rules of capitalism, Jr. collected Chinese porcelain and studied medieval architecture. While his father testified before Congress, facing accusations of monopoly and corruption, Jr. retreated into books about Italian gardens and Japanese aesthetics. He was the reluctant prince of American industry, and the weight was breaking him. That summer, doctors told him he was on the verge of collapse. Nervous exhaustion, they called it. What we'd now recognize as severe depression and anxiety. His father's empire was under siege, the Supreme Court was about to break up Standard Oil, and Jr. was expected to salvage the family name, to transform the Rockefeller fortune from something reviled into something respected. The pressure was relentless. Newspapers ran cartoons depicting his father as an octopus strangling the nation. Muckraking journalists like Ida Tarbell exposed the brutal tactics Standard Oil had used to eliminate competition. Jr. would wake up at night, sheets soaked with sweat, thinking about the families his father's company had ruined. The small refiners driven to bankruptcy, the railroad workers squeezed by secret rebate deals, the weight of all that money, all that power, all that resentment. His father didn't understand. Senior had come from nothing, a traveling salesman's son who'd built the greatest fortune in human history through sheer will and ruthless efficiency. To him, business was war, and sentiment was weakness. But Jr. was different. He'd grown up with tutors and trips to Europe. He'd been raised on Bach and Dante, not balance sheets and market share. But first, he needed to breathe. So he came to Maine, to this raw granite island where the mountains meet the sea, where wealthy families from Boston and New York had started building summer cottages. Mansions, really. But they called them cottages with that particular brand of old money modesty. Jr. bought 230 acres on the quietest part of the island, not on the fashionable side where the Vanderbilts and Astors gathered, but here on the eastern shore, where the land was rougher, more isolated, more honest. He called it the Eyrie, the eagle's nest. The name itself was a declaration. Eagles don't gather in flocks. They build their nests in solitary places high above the noise. They watch, they wait. They understand the landscape from a perspective others can't reach. That's what Jr. needed, not to escape, but to rise high enough to see clearly. At first, it seemed like exactly what he needed. He hired Waddy Butler Wood, a respected architect who understood restraint. No gilded ballrooms, no marble imported from Carrara. This would be different. This would be a place to think, to rest, to figure out who John D. Rockefeller Jr. actually was, separate from the name that defined him. The main house rose from the granite in 1914, built from local stone and weathered shingles. It looked almost humble from the outside, long and low, spreading across the clifftop like it had grown there naturally. 70 rooms, but you'd never count them from the road. The architecture was deliberate in its understatement. Arts and crafts style mixed with colonial revival. materials chosen to weather an age, to become part of the landscape rather than conquer it. Inside, rooms opened onto rooms, each one offering a different frame of the ocean. There was a simplicity to it, a deliberate quietness that felt like rebellion against everything the Rockefeller name represented. Oak floors, plain white walls, furniture chosen for comfort rather than display. The only real luxury was space, space to think, space to breathe, space to become something other than an heir. Junior walked those cliffs every morning. He swam in the freezing ocean, shocking his system awake. He read poetry to his children, Abby, John III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, David. 6 children who would reshape American philanthropy, politics, and culture. But here, they were just kids building forts in the woods, sailing dinghies in the bay, learning to love this raw, beautiful place. He taught them to identify birds by their calls, to read the weather in the color of the ocean, to understand that the best view wasn't from the biggest house, but from the quiet spot where you could hear yourself think. These weren't lessons you could learn in the boardrooms of New York or the libraries of their Fifth Avenue mansion. These were lessons the land itself taught, if you were willing to listen. For a few summers, it worked. The Eyrie became their sanctuary. Abby, Junior's wife, filled the house with art and laughter. She was everything he wasn't: bold, curious, unafraid of color and controversy. While Junior collected ancient Asian art with scholarly precision, Abby bought works by living artists, abstract painters and modern sculptors that made her mother-in-law clutch her pearls. She hung a Picasso in the dining room, a Matisse in the hallway. Art that challenged, that provoked, that refused to be polite. The Eyrie became a place where those two worlds could coexist, where tradition and innovation lived under the same roof. Where Junior's careful restraint and Abby's bold experimentation created something neither could have built alone: a home that honored the past while reaching toward the future. Junior built trails through the property, stone paths that wound through spruce forests and along cliff tops. He didn't just hire workers to do it, he worked alongside them, moving stones with his own hands, learning which trees could bend in the coastal wind and which would snap. He learned the names of every bird, every wildflower. Ladies' slipper orchids in the deep woods, beach roses clinging to rocky shores, bald eagles nesting in the tallest pines. He started giving money away, not randomly, but carefully, intentionally. Libraries, universities, the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, bringing American history to life in a way that would educate millions. The land that would become Grand Teton National Park, preserving wilderness in perpetuity. He was trying to alchemize his father's gold into something that would last, something that would matter. And for a while, standing on those cliffs at the Eyrie, watching his children grow up with salt spray in their hair and granite under their feet, it seemed possible. It seemed like maybe he'd found the answer. Then 1929 arrived. The stock market collapsed on a Tuesday in October. Within days, fortunes vanished. By the end of the month, $30 billion in stock value had evaporated, more than the United States had spent on World War I. Banks failed, factories closed, bread lines stretched around city blocks. The Great Depression spread across America like a darkness. And suddenly, being a Rockefeller meant something different, something dangerous. The family had to hire security. There were threats, kidnapping plots. The Lindbergh baby was taken in 1932, and every wealthy family in America tightened their circles, looked over their shoulders, wondered if their children were safe. The world looked at their wealth with new eyes, not with envy anymore, but with rage. How could anyone have so much when so many had nothing? Junior felt it every time he walked the streets of New York, the stares, the whispers. Sometimes worse. He poured money into relief efforts, funded public works, kept a construction going on Rockefeller Center even when it made no financial sense, Because it kept thousands employed. But nothing felt like enough. The gap between what he had and what others lacked was a chasm no amount of charity could bridge. Junior's father died in 1937 at 97, having lived long enough to see his empire broken apart by the government, but also long enough to see his son transform their name. Senior's last years were spent giving away dimes to children, a public relations gesture that became iconic. The richest man in history, reduced to a smiling old man in newsreels, handing out 10-cent pieces. But it was Junior who carried the real weight. How do you honor a legacy built on monopoly and controversy? How do you make peace with power? His father had been a force of nature, brilliant, ruthless, utterly convinced of his own righteousness. He'd given away half his fortune before he died, but he'd never apologized for how he'd earned it. That wasn't his way. The burden of transformation fell to Junior. And some nights, lying awake at the Erie, listening to waves crash against granite, he wondered if it was possible, if you could ever really wash blood money clean. He thought the Erie might still hold answers, but something had shifted. The sanctuary was starting to feel like something else, like a beautiful cage, like a place built on questions that had no answers. The world was changing, and so was he. Through the 1930s and 40s, the Erie transformed from a retreat into a laboratory for a new kind of American legacy. Junior doubled down on his vision. If his father had built an empire of oil, he would build an empire of culture. He poured money into Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, creating a city within a city during the depths of the Depression, putting thousands to work when work was impossible to find. The project lost money for years, millions of dollars bleeding into construction when every economic advisor said to stop. But Junior kept going. Not because it made financial sense, but because it kept men employed, kept families fed, kept hope alive in a city that was forgetting what hope felt like. He bought the land that became the United Nations headquarters, donating $8.5 million worth of Manhattan real estate because he believed nations should have a place to talk instead of fight. He funded the restoration of Versailles and Reims Cathedral in France, helping a devastated Europe rebuild its cultural heritage after World War I. He gave the Cloisters Museum to New York City, a medieval monastery reconstructed stone by stone overlooking the Hudson River. And most importantly, for the Erie, he gave Acadia National Park most of its land, over 11,000 acres on Mount Desert Island, including miles of the coastline visible from his terrace. He built 45 miles of carriage roads through the park, stone-faced roads that banned cars, where visitors could ride horses or bicycles through preserved wilderness. Roads that exist today exactly as he designed them, because he built them to last centuries. Every summer he returned to Maine to walk his trails and show his growing sons what he was building. Not buildings, but something larger. A philosophy of stewardship. A belief that ownership was temporary, but protection could be permanent. His sons grew up watching this transformation. They saw their father wake at dawn every single day to walk the same loop through the Erie's grounds, checking on trees he'd planted years before, picking up litter that visitors had dropped on public trails beyond his property line, stopping to talk with the local stonemasons repairing walls, asking about their families, their children's schools, remembering names and details that most wealthy men wouldn't bother to learn. Nelson, the third son, was the most like his grandfather, ambitious, political, hungry for power. But even he absorbed his father's lessons. Years later, as governor of New York, he would push through environmental protections and urban renewal projects that prioritized public good over private profit. "My father taught me that power without purpose is just noise," Nelson said once. "The question isn't what you can take, it's what you can protect." The house itself remained deliberately modest by Gilded Age standards. While other families on the island competed to build larger cottages, 60, 80, 100 rooms, the Erie stayed the same size Junior had originally planned, He added a few structures over the years: a boathouse for the family's sailing vessels, a lodge for guests and staff, a garage for the cars they'd drive from New York each June. But he never expanded the main house, never added a ballroom or a grand entrance, never installed the gold-plated fixtures or imported chandeliers that marked other estates as monuments to wealth. Junior commissioned Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., son of the man who designed Central Park, to help plan the grounds. They spent days walking the property together, Olmsted sketching ideas, Junior vetoing anything that felt too controlled, too formal. "The land is already perfect," Junior insisted. "We're just revealing what's here." Olmsted understood. Together they created paths that followed natural contours, plantings that enhanced rather than dominated native species, views that framed the ocean without trying to own it. The landscape architecture at the Eyrie became a masterclass in restraint, so subtle that most visitors never realized it was designed at all. It just felt right. Inevitable, as if the paths and gardens had always been there, waiting to be discovered. Abby filled the Eyrie with her growing art collection. Works by Picasso and Matisse hung beside Chinese scrolls and medieval tapestries. She founded the Museum of Modern Art in 1929, right as the Depression hit, because she believed art mattered most when the world was falling apart. The Eyrie became a place where she could experiment, where visiting artists and intellectuals would sit on the terrace as the sun set over Frenchman Bay and debate the purpose of art, the responsibility of wealth, the future of a country trying to find its way through depression and then war. Diego Rivera came to visit, the Mexican muralist whose communist politics made him controversial, but whose talent was undeniable. Georgia O'Keeffe spent a summer there, painting the rocky coastline with her characteristic intensity. These weren't just social visits. Abby was building a network, creating connections between artists who needed support and wealthy patrons who could provide it. The Eyrie became a quiet node in a larger cultural revolution, a place where modern art found its American footing. Junior's sons grew up between two worlds. In New York, they were Rockefellers, trained in business, politics, duty, the weight of the name they carried. But at the Eyrie, they were just boys who knew how to read the tide, how to identify a peregrine falcon by its silhouette, how to sit quietly in the morning fog and feel small in the best possible way. They sailed wooden boats in races against local children. They hiked mountains and swam in water so cold it stopped your breath. They learned to navigate by stars and weather, to respect the ocean's power, to understand that nature doesn't care about your last name or your bank account. The granite cliffs and pine forests of Maine were the great equalizer. Nelson, who would become governor of New York and vice president of the United States, always said his real education happened on those cliffs, watching his father walk the same path every morning, stopping to pick up litter other visitors had left, pulling invasive plants with his bare hands. Power, Nelson learned, wasn't about domination. It was about stewardship. Lawrence, the fourth son, developed his love of conservation at the Eyrie, later becoming one of the 20th century's great environmental philanthropists, protecting millions of acres of wilderness. Winthrop, the fifth son, learned compassion watching his father talk to staff and workers as equals, lessons he'd carry to Arkansas, where he became governor and fought for civil rights in the Deep South. David, the youngest, absorbed it all: the art, the conservation, the careful philanthropy, the daily discipline of walking the same trails and never taking the view for granted. He'd become a banker and philanthropist who would, over his century-long life, give away more money more thoughtfully than almost anyone in American history. By the late 1940s, the Eyrie had become exactly what Junior had dreamed: not a monument to wealth, but a testament to what wealth could become when it was held lightly, spent carefully, invested in things that would outlast any single lifetime. Junior was in his 70s now, his hair white, his face weathered by decades of walking in coastal wind. but he still walked those trails every day, rain or shine. The house was filled with grandchildren every summer, the next generation of Rockefellers learning the same lessons. The family joke was that Papa Jr. knew every single stone on every single trail, and if you moved one, he'd notice. He probably did. This was the peak. The moment when everything Junior had built, his philanthropy, his family, his quiet rebellion against his father's ruthless legacy, seemed to have worked. The Rockefeller name no longer meant monopoly and corruption. It meant art museums and national parks. It meant careful restoration and thoughtful giving. It meant a different kind of power. Standing on the terrace of the Eyrie in the summer of 1959, watching his grandchildren play on the rocks below while Abby read in her favorite chair, Junior could see the architecture of his life's work spreading out before him. Not just the physical landscape he'd helped protect, but something larger, a new American aristocracy built not on extraction, but contribution, not on taking, but giving back. He was 85 years old. He had done what seemed impossible. He had redeemed his father's name and defined his own. And then, in May of 1960, John D. Rockefeller Jr. died quietly at the Eyrie in his sleep, with the sound of waves against granite filling the room. The family gathered that summer to grieve, to remember, to try to understand what came next. His children walked his trails, retracing paths they'd walked with him 10,000 times. They sat on the terrace where he'd sat every evening, watching the same sunset. They tried to feel his presence in the house he'd loved. And slowly, quietly, they realized something that none of them wanted to say out loud. The Eyrie was too much, not too large. It had never been about size, but too specific, too personal, too perfectly calibrated to one man's particular vision of restraint and beauty. Junior's sons had their own lives now, their own summer places, their own ways of being Rockefellers. Nelson had a compound in Westchester. David preferred the Caribbean. The grandchildren were scattered across the country, building their own versions of what it meant to carry the name. The house still stood, beautiful as ever. The trails were still maintained. The views were still breathtaking. But something essential had left with Junior. The animating spirit. The daily presence of the man who had walked every inch of this land, who had known every stone, who had poured his whole broken, determined heart into making this place mean something. For a few years, the family tried to keep it going. They took turns spending summers there. They maintained the buildings, paid the staff, kept the grounds immaculate. But it felt different now, like they were curating a museum instead of living in a home. And then came the question no one wanted to ask. What do you do with a sanctuary when the person who created it is gone? The answer, it turned out, was heartbreaking. In 1963, 3 years after Junior's death, the family made their decision. They would sell the Eyrie. The announcement was kept quiet. No public listing. No newspaper coverage. The Rockefellers didn't need to advertise. Word spread through the tight circles of American wealth, and buyers emerged. Not because they needed the money. The Rockefellers would never need money. But because keeping it felt like trying to preserve something that was meant to be lived, not frozen in amber. Junior had taught them about stewardship, about the difference between possessing and protecting. And they knew, painfully, reluctantly, that holding on to the Eyrie out of sentiment alone would betray everything it had meant. Junior had never wanted the Eyrie to become a shrine. He'd wanted it to be alive, useful, constantly evolving. Keeping it as a memorial would have turned it into exactly the kind of monument he'd spent his life avoiding. So, his children made the hard choice. They let it go. The estate was purchased by a private buyer who promised to maintain its character. The family took comfort in that promise. They packed up Abby's art collection, the Picassos and Matisses that had hung in the simple rooms, creating such beautiful tension between restraint and boldness. They removed family photographs and personal effects. They left the structure intact, the trails maintained, hoping the new owners would understand what they'd been given. But promises are fragile things. Over the following decades, the Eyrie changed hands several times. Some owners respected its history, walking the trails Junior had walked, understanding the philosophy embedded in every stone. Others saw opportunity. The real estate market on Mount Desert Island was exploding. What had been a quiet refuge for a few wealthy families was becoming a destination, property values soaring as more people discovered Maine's rugged beauty. Pieces of the land were subdivided. Some of Junior's carefully planned views were blocked by new construction. His trails, the ones he'd built by hand, stone by stone, fell into disrepair. Invasive species he'd spent decades removing crept back. The boathouse was converted into a private residence. The guest lodge was sold off separately. By the 1990s, the Eyrie had become what Junior had specifically tried to prevent. Just another large house on an island full of large houses. Beautiful, certainly. Valuable, absolutely. Worth millions, but no longer singular. No longer a statement about what wealth could become when held in open hands. The Rockefeller family watched from a distance. Some of Junior's grandchildren would occasionally drive past on trips to Acadia, but they rarely stopped. It hurt too much. Like visiting the childhood home where a beloved parent had died, now occupied by strangers who'd painted over all the walls and removed the garden. Peggy Rockefeller, David's wife, tried to visit once in the 1980s. She made it as far as the driveway before turning back. "It's not our area anymore," she told David later. "The bones are there, but the soul is gone." The house that had been built to last forever, to embody a philosophy of thoughtful permanence, had become just another piece of coastal real estate. The irony was almost too perfect. Junior had spent his life trying to prove that wealth could be transformed into something meaningful, something that would last. And his own sanctuary, the place where he'd developed that philosophy, couldn't survive a generation past his death. But here's what the family understood, even in their grief. Junior had actually succeeded. Not with the house itself. That was always just stone and shingle, subject to time and transaction. But with the idea the house represented, that's what lasted. Every national park Junior helped create is still there. Acadia, just down the road from the Eyrie, welcomes over 3.5 million visitors every year. Families from every background hike trails Junior funded, stand on cliffs Junior helped protect, watch the sunrise from Cadillac Mountain, because he believed some things should belong to everyone, not just those who could afford oceanfront property. The carriage roads he built through Acadia are still there. 45 miles of perfectly maintained gravel paths where cars are banned, where you can bike or walk or ride horses through preserved wilderness, just as Junior intended. Those roads will outlast the Eyrie by centuries. They were built better, maintained by public commitment rather than private whim. The Museum of Modern Art that Abby founded is still introducing new generations to artists who challenge and inspire. It's one of the most visited museums in the world now, democratizing access to art in exactly the way she dreamed. The Cloisters still stands overlooking the Hudson. Colonial Williamsburg still teaches millions about American history. The United Nations headquarters, built on land Junior donated, still stands as a testament to the belief that nations can talk instead of fight. And Junior's children and grandchildren continued his work in ways he couldn't have imagined. Nelson, who learned about power on those Maine cliffs, shaped New York State for 15 years as governor, creating the state university system that gave hundreds of thousands of working-class kids access to higher education. He pushed through environmental protections that preserved the Adirondacks and regulated development along the Hudson River. David became a banker and philanthropist who funded urban renewal and environmental conservation, giving away over $2 billion in his lifetime. He supported Harvard, Rockefeller University, the Museum of Modern Art. He helped rebuild Lower Manhattan after 9/11. He funded conservation projects in Maine, protecting thousands of acres near where the Eyrie once stood as his family's private sanctuary. Lawrence created venture capital firms that funded everything from airlines to computer companies, democratizing innovation by proving that patient capital could build transformative businesses. He also became one of America's great conservation philanthropists, protecting national parks and wilderness areas across the country. Winthrop became governor of Arkansas and worked for civil rights in the Deep South during the 1960s, using his position and his name to push for integration and equal rights when it was deeply unpopular and personally dangerous. He appointed the first African Americans to state boards and commissions. He reformed the brutal prison system. He lived the values of service and stewardship his father had taught him on those Maine cliffs. The philosophy Junior developed while walking those trails at the Eyrie, that wealth is temporary, but impact can be permanent, that possession is less important than protection, that the purpose of power is service, spread through his descendants like a genetic code. In 2008, David Rockefeller, Jr.'s youngest son, published his memoirs at 93 years old. He wrote about the Eyrie with the kind of tenderness usually reserved for first loves. He described mornings watching his father walk the same path every day, never taking a single step for granted. He wrote about sailing with his brothers in Frenchman Bay, about hikes through the forests where his father taught him to identify birds by their songs. He described his grandfather Senior's ruthlessness honestly, without flinching. The union busting, the predatory pricing, the secret deals and political manipulation. He didn't excuse it or pretend it hadn't happened, but he also wrote about his father's quiet rebellion with pride and understanding. "My father taught us that a name is only as good as what you do with it," David wrote. He showed us that you can inherit wealth without inheriting the methods that created it, that you can honor a legacy by transforming it into something better. He proved that redemption is possible, but it requires more than money. It requires daily commitment, humility, and the courage to build something different than what came before. David died in 2017 at 101 years old, the last of Junior's children. He'd spent his impossibly long life giving away the family fortune according to his father's principles, carefully, strategically, in ways designed to create permanent change. By the time he died, he'd donated over $2 billion to universities, museums, conservation projects, and medical research. At his memorial service, speaker after speaker talked about his generosity, his vision, his impact. But David had once said the most important thing his father taught him wasn't about giving money away. It was about walking the same trail every morning, about learning the names of birds, about picking up litter even when no one was watching, about understanding that stewardship is a practice, not a transaction. The Eyrie itself still stands, perched on its granite cliff overlooking Frenchman Bay. The current owners maintain it well. The structure is sound. The grounds are kept. Sometimes historians or architecture enthusiasts get permission to visit. They walk through rooms where Picasso's once hung, stand on the terrace where Junior planned some of the 20th century's greatest philanthropic projects, look out at views that inspired a vision of stewardship that changed American giving forever. But most people have never heard of the Eyrie. It's not on the tourist maps. It's not featured in documentaries about the Rockefellers. Unlike the grand estates of the Gilded Age, the Vanderbilt mansions, the Hearst Castle, the Breakers in Newport, the Eyrie remained what Junior always wanted it to be: quiet, private, a place that did its work not through display but through the ideas it nurtured. And maybe that's the point. Maybe that's exactly what Junior intended. He spent his entire life trying to solve an impossible problem. How do you make peace with extraordinary inherited wealth? How do you transform money earned through monopoly and hardball capitalism into something that serves rather than dominates? How do you build a legacy that matters when you start with more than anyone should have? The Eyrie was his laboratory. Every stone path he laid, every trail he cleared, every decision to preserve rather than develop was an experiment in a different kind of power. Not the power to take and accumulate that his father wielded, but the power to protect and give back. The experiment worked, just not in the way you'd expect. Today, you can stand in Acadia National Park on one of the carriage roads Junior funded and look toward where the Eyrie sits on its granite cliff. You won't see the house. Junior made sure his trails never created views into his own property. He wanted people to look out, not in, to see the ocean, the islands, the endless sky, to experience wonder without knowing who made it possible. That view has remained unchanged for over a century, not because the Rockefeller family still owns the land, but because Junior helped create a system, national parks, conservation easements, protected lands, that ensures some places remain places, not properties. Thousands of people stand on those cliffs every summer. They watch the sunrise that Junior watched. They breathe the same salt air. They feel the same granite under their feet. And they have no idea that the man who made it possible once stood in almost exactly the same spot, wondering if anything he was building would matter after he was gone. It did, more than he could have imagined. The house is just a house now. Its original purpose faded, its specific history known to fewer and fewer people with each passing year. But the idea the house represented, that wealth carries responsibility, that power should protect rather than possess, that the highest use of privilege is to ensure others can experience what you've experienced. That idea is still standing, still growing, still teaching anyone willing to listen that what you leave behind isn't measured in acres or architecture, in houses or bank accounts, but in what you make possible for people you'll never meet. Junior understood that. He learned it walking those trails every morning for 50 years, in rain and shine, through grief and joy, never missing a day, never taking a single step for granted. He built it into his children with the quiet patience of someone who understood that real change takes generations. They built it into theirs. And now, more than a century after he first stood on those cliffs looking for answers, his question has become his answer. What do you leave behind when you have everything? You leave everything behind. You give it away carefully, protect it fiercely, and trust that the ideas you planted will grow in soil you'll never see, and you make sure it lasts. Not the house, not the property, not the name carved in stone, the idea, the practice, the daily choice to be a steward instead of an owner. That's what lasts. That's what Junior built at the Eyrie, and that's still standing.